Perhaps the greatest equivalent to July 4th is Bastille Day, French Independence Day, celebrated with raucous parties, parades, celebrations, and fireworks as the French call back in their history to honor their democratic experiment which began in the 1780s, celebrating the Fifth Republic which continues on that legacy of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Bastille Day is based in the siege of the Bastille by the French revolutionaries, but the revolution itself predated even the storming of the Bastille by at least 2 weeks. It was a revolution that was steeped in reason and democracy that soon turned to chaos, disorder, and eventually tyranny under the imperial rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French establishment, the French upper classes and middle classes, clearly did not understand the plight of the peasants. The French king, Louis XVI, who had ruled since 1775, had continually alienated his people until resistance to his regime and autocracy brought about real political change. A neo-absolutist monarchy combined with an old feudal structure which kept the king and the clergy, the first estate, and the nobility, second estate, in prime control of the country, alienated the vast majority of the country who were peasants struggling to survive. France was further bankrupted by its efforts in helping the Americans achieve independence against France's great rival, the British. And despite their ability to get revenge against the British, the French economy was bankrupted. Compare the ostentation of the 3%, the nobility, the clergy, and especially the king, along with his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette, who was hated because she was a foreigner, compared vastly with the peasants, who worked their fields, the vast majority of whom really were little more than serfs, very few of them owning the land, and upwards of 90% of them but depending on their wages to get them solid basic needs, such as bread and shelter. The crippling weight of a third estate brought the Ancien regime to its knees, and in 1789 the king called the Estates General, combining the three estates so that they could figure out potential solutions to the problems the French continued to struggle with. This meeting went nowhere. The third estate, which was mainly comprised of businessmen, craftsmen, merchants, and the most wealthy of farmers who owned land, were advocating for themselves and the 88% of the population that was the peasantry. Comfortable with their lot in life, the first and second estate, along with the monarchy, did little to pacify the growing demands of the third estate. The third estate was eventually shut out of the Estates General and went to a nearby tennis court where they swore an oath to continue meeting until the problems of their government had been resolved. This was the creation of a National Assembly, the governing body of France for the next decade. They would create a constitution, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Inspired by the American Constitution and Declaration of Independence, it was written partially by the Marquis de Lafayette, fresh off of his assistance to the Americans, and partially by Thomas Jefferson, who was a huge influence in the French court at the time. Advocating for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, unlimited democracy, the equality of all people, and other Enlightenment ideas inspired by Voltaire and others, it was an attempt to bring equanimity between the lower classes and the upper classes. However, it would require force in order for it to become effective. The king still ruled. So on July 14th, seeking to gain munitions, supporters, and free political prisoners, rebels, thousands of them, overwhelmed the French guards at the Bastille, storming it. This was the beginning of a violent side of the French Revolution, a revolution that would become predominantly known for its violence. As fighting between the government and the rebels intensified, women joined the fray, making their voices known in October as they marched to the Palace of Versailles and demanded for better rights and working conditions. These cries fell on the deaf ears of Marie Antoinette, who was already hated because of her Austrian status. The royal family and the Ancien regime were becoming increasingly unpopular until the king was forced to abdicate. He tried to flee, but his family was brought back to France. By this time, the National Assembly was becoming the predominant government of France in the early 1790s and was already dividing itself between two parties. The Grignons, who believed in a constitutional monarchy, keeping the Bourbons on the throne, and the Jacobins, led by the very charismatic, persuasive, and dictatorial Maximilien Robespierre, who believed that anyone who was contrary to the revolutionary interests and the ideas of reason and truth should be punished. This led to the creation of public safety, which was supposed to do what it could to maintain the new republic of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, using a new invention, the guillotine, they would inspire the Reign of Terror in the 1790s, with their first two victims being the former monarchs, as it was clear that a constitutional monarchy was not in the cards for the French at the time. Louis XVI was murdered in 1793, and between 1793 and 1794, thousands of counter-revolutionaries would be executed by the French government, usually through the beheading practice of the guillotine, to public audiences, who were soon brought to dismay and to fear to the growing governmental powers. No one was safe. Not the old establishment, not the nobles, not the church. Counter-revolutionaries fighting all throughout the country were constantly crushed, and the French government sent out its military to battle against Europeans who were trying to take advantage of France's beleaguered political establishment during the 1790s. The irony of the French Revolution was growing. As violence continued to intensify, the government continued to secularize. It separated church and state, created a new calendar, declared equality between the sexes, and did everything it can to help the plight of the poor and suffering. However, they were also becoming more and more ironically susceptible to violence and tyranny. As a young general, Napoleon Bonaparte became their greatest force against fighting vicious European allies who were doing everything they could to avenge the death of the Bourbons. Eventually, the Committee of Public Safety, which was continually becoming more and more unsafe, proved that no one was safe, not even its leader, Maximilien Robespierre, who was shot, put on trial, and eventually executed in 1794. The Jacobins and the radical Republicans, who had demanded the right to get rid of all old institutions, the monarchy, the nobility, and the clergy, became more and more unpopular as more moderate forms of government, including constitutional monarchy, gained the upper hand. Some of these people have been imprisoned, some of them have been killed as enemies of the revolution, but by the late 1790s it was clear that the French Revolution had devolved into a bloodbath and myriad of conspiracy, fighting, and paranoia. It was only Napoleon himself who rose to power in the late 1790s and established the first consul in 1799, who, through his own love of the revolutionary ideas, could supposedly save it. He did this by becoming the overlord of the French and eventually crowning himself the emperor in 1804. The irony upon ironies was that a true believer in the French Revolution used its chaos and unfolding to make himself the most powerful man in Europe, an emperor, contrary to all Jacobin ideas, contrary to many of the principles of the French Revolution. Yet the ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, as well as radical democracy, were spread prolifically by Napoleon throughout his conquest during the first 2 decades of the 19th century. The French Revolution continued to impact republics that were later born, and despite the fact that the French returned to a constitutional monarchy after Napoleon, throughout much of the 19th century and into the 20th century, France would continue experiments with republican government until, by the beginning of the 20th century, they were the only major republic in Europe. Later political and social revolutions would not be the same without the French one, even the ones the French had in 1831, 1848, and 1871. The truth of the matter is the French Republic has been completely formed, even in its modern day, by the events of the French Revolution. And without the French Revolution, there is no modern French state. There is no modern radical democracy. And there is no modern republican version of government in Western Europe without the way the French brought it about in their revolution that started with Bastille Day, July 14, 1789.